Today for natural science, we are going to talk about heat and matter. If matter absorbs heat, its temperature increases and it gets warmer. As you can see here, there's a kettle on a stove. So, how does this work? The stove provides the heat. The tea kettle absorbs the heat. And the temperature of the kettle increases. So the heat is absorbed by the water and makes it warmer. And you get a hot cup of tea, as you can see here. So, now that the water is out of the kettle, off of the stove, we can see it emitting heat. You can see that here with the steam. And as it emits the heat, as it lets off the heat, the water cools down. So, if matter emits heat, its temperature decreases and it gets cooler. So what happens when two objects with different temperatures come in contact with each other? The heat transfers from the warmer object to the cooler object. And it does this until they are the same temperature.
Heat is actually a form of energy that is being transferred from a substance at a higher temperature to another substance or substances at a lower temperature. Have you ever touched a hot pot that was on a stove? What happens when you touch it? It burns your hand because the heat energy is transferring from the hot pot to your hand. Your hand had a different temperature than the hot pot. Your hand was much cooler than the hot pot. Heat energy always travels from a hotter substance to the colder substance. In this case, it travels from the pot to your hand. Think about what happens to a mug of coffee when you pour hot coffee into it. The mug felt cool at first, but then felt hotter as you poured the hot coffee into it. The hot coffee transferred its heat energy to the mug, which was cooler.
Okay, so you have this example in your book, but I'm just going to explain it a little bit more. So you have this pan here with water that's 40 degrees. And then you have this cup with water that's 90 degrees. So what do you think is going to happen based on what we know, what we just talked about? So the water in the glass that's 90 degrees is going to warm the water in the pan, right? So the hotter object is transferring heat to the cooler object. And it's going to do this until they're both the same temperature. Let's see here. So it does it until they're both 60 degrees Celsius. So the water in the pan that was 40 degrees was transferred heat and warmed up to 60. And the water that was 90 degrees in the cup cools down to 60. And now they're both the same temperature. Okay, so in the last lesson, we learned that heat causes matter to change temperature. But it also does something else. Heat causes matter to change size. It can expand which means when an object gets hot, it gets bigger. For example, we have this object. If we heat it, it will become bigger. And we say that this object expanded. Now, it can also contract. And this is when an object cools down, it gets smaller. So here we have an object being cooled down and getting smaller. So we would say this object contracted. Now we're going to look at an experiment to see how this works.
Hi, I'm Jared and welcome to our YouTube channel, Fun Science Demonstrations. The big idea here is that things expand, they get bigger when you heat them up. It doesn't matter if it's a solid, if it's a liquid, if it's a gas, they will expand, they will get bigger if you apply heat. We have heat and we have things, and I want to see if that's really true. So I have a metal rod. We're going to apply heat to that rod, and how do I tell if it gets bigger? Well, we set up a little gauge. All it is a little needle that the rod's setting on with a pointer. Then I have color-coded lines, and if that rod does get bigger, it's going to lengthen and push the needle. The needle's going to roll, and the pointer should move. Well, we'll see if science really works. So we need to apply the heat. I have the heat. We're going to fire this up, literally, and we're going to start heating this rod. When we heat the rod, you can't see it happening because it's microscopic on the small level. You can't see with your eyes. The molecules inside are moving around faster and faster. More space, they're lengthening, spreading out, and that's why this rod should be getting longer and expanding. You might see this if you're observant when you're driving in the car and the power lines, telephone lines, in the summer they sag because it's hot and the metal inside gets longer. In the winter, it cools down and it actually shortens up. They're not as loose. So my meter should be moving, and you should actually visibly see it moving as I really heat up the entire rod. It's such a simple demonstration, but science really works. You can see it happening. I'm going to stop, peek. The meter moved. Imagine that. Things actually expand and get bigger when you heat them up. They shrink and condense and get smaller when you cool them down. Science is amazing. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so what that experiment showed us is a piece of metal actually expanding. So it's showing what we just learned in action. And now finally we're going to talk about different materials. Some materials we call conductors. What does this mean? Some material we call insulators. Conductors let heat pass through them. So, for example, we want to have conductors when we're cooking, like pots, things that are metal, because it allows the heat to pass through and cook our food. Now, the opposite of this is an insulator. These do not let heat pass through them. And we want this kind of material also for cooking. For example, wooden spoons. You wouldn't want heat to pass through the spoons you're using to cook, or else you would burn your hand. So one example of an insulator is wood. Alright, so that concludes our lesson on heat and matter. Hope that this helped you understand it better.